Listen carefully. This is not a headline. It's a diagnostic. Because if an Israeli F-35 is really operating over Tehran, and if the IDF is right that it just shot down an Iranian Yak-130 in air-to-air combat, then you're not watching a regional flare-up. You're watching a system crossing a threshold it has been walking toward for years. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop. This isn't accidental. It's the predictable output of a machine, built step by step, where credibility decays, debt rises, deterrence thins, and eventually one decision in the sky becomes the least bad option on a collapsing menu. Right now, the numbers tell you the machine is under strain. Global debt reached about $348 trillion by the end of 2025, after roughly $29 trillion was added in a single year. Military spending hit a record too, $718 trillion in 2024, the steepest annual rise in decades. In plain language, the world is borrowing like stability is guaranteed, while rearming like stability is dying. So don't argue about whether a 16-second clip proves everything. That's not the real question. The real question is, what kind of world produces the need for a stealth fighter to prove a point over an enemy capital? Tonight, I'm going to show you a repeating pattern, a four-stage mechanism that has governed empires, currencies, and security orders for more than a century. Then we'll run that same mechanism over this moment, step by step, until the conclusion is unavoidable. And at the end, I'll tell you the next move the machine usually makes after a first-of-its-kind precedent, and what you can do so you're not caught reacting when the stage changes again. Here's the mechanism. It is always the same. Stage one is the setup. A dominant order forms around a bargain. It might be a security umbrella, a trade network, a reserve currency, or an alliance system. It creates stability, but stability creates dependency. Dependency creates blind spots. Stage two is expansion. The order stretches past its original capacity. Commitments multiply, money gets easier, promises grow faster than real resources. On the surface, it looks like strength. Underneath, it's leverage. Stage three is crisis. The bill arrives. Energy shocks, tactical surprises, demographic strain. The challenger tests the boundaries. Credibility becomes the scarce commodity, so leaders start paying for credibility with escalation. Stage four is the outcome. The system chooses a visible precedent-setting act, a blockade, an intervention, a decisive strike, a regime change attempt, an air-to-air kill over a capital. Because it must prove it still controls reality. The precedent becomes a new baseline, and once baselines move, they rarely move back. If that sounds abstract, good. Abstraction is where the machine hides. So we prove it with history, 3 times, fast, clear, and surgical. First proof, Britain's order sliding into World War I. Setup. In the late 1800s, Britain sits at the center of global trade and finance. The gold standard anchors confidence. The Royal Navy protects the sea lanes. London becomes the clearinghouse of world commerce. The bargain is simple. Stability, as long as Britain's maritime supremacy is accepted. Expansion. Then Germany unifies in 1871 and industrializes at speed. Production turns into ambition. Naval laws push a fleet buildup. Britain responds. Then HMS Dreadnought launches in 1906 and resets the meaning of power overnight, forcing everyone to chase a new standard. Technology doesn't just upgrade weapons, it upgrades fear. At the same time, the alliance map hardens. Germany aligns with Austria-Hungary. France aligns with Russia. Britain, historically allergic to entanglement, edges into understandings that become the triple entente. On paper, it's balance. In reality, it's commitments without flexibility, leverage disguised as security. Crisis? Now watch the corridor narrow. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is not the cause. It's the pin pulled from a system already stacked with explosives. Austria issues an ultimatum designed to be rejected. Russia mobilizes. Germany offers the blank check. France aligns to avoid isolation. Britain faces the credibility dilemma. If Germany dominates the continent, Britain's bargain collapses. And here's the systemic detail people miss. Mobilization timetables and war plans turn diplomacy into a race against the clock. Once you mobilize, you lose options. Once you lose options, you lose de-escalation. Leaders are choosing, but only inside a corridor built by the system itself. Outcome. War becomes the proof of credibility. It becomes the settlement tool when diplomacy can't settle anything. The result isn't just casualties, it's a repricing of global power, debt explosions, and a shift of financial gravity toward the United States. The old order doesn't just bleed, it loses legitimacy. That is the mechanism. When commitments exceed flexibility, the system escalates to restore belief. Second proof, America's monetary order, from Bretton Woods to the Nixon shock to stagflation. Setup. In 1944, Bretton Woods builds a post-war architecture, Currencies peg to the dollar. The dollar pegs to gold at $35 an ounce. The world gets liquidity and reconstruction. The U.S. gets monetary leadership. It's a stability machine, expansion. Then the expansion phase arrives quietly. Cold War spending rises. Vietnam spending rises. Domestic programs expand. The U.S. runs persistent deficits and exports dollars. Foreign central banks accumulate those dollars as reserves. Economists name the tension, the Triffin dilemma. To supply global liquidity, the reserve issuer must run deficits, but the deficits eventually undermine faith in convertibility. As long as confidence holds, the system holds. But confidence is not a metal in a vault. It's a story. Crisis. By the late 1960s, the story cracks. Claims on U.S. gold don't match the gold stock. Nations test the promise by demanding gold for dollars. The U.S. faces a brutal choice. Tighten hard and risk recession and political backlash, or break the promise and risk global upheaval. Outcome. In August 1971, Nixon closes the gold window. The anchor breaks. And what follows is the lesson. Breaking an anchor doesn't erase costs. It relocates them. The 1970s bring inflation, oil shocks, and stagflation, the nightmare mix of rising prices and weak growth. Then the system does what systems do when belief collapses. It chooses an extreme move to restore credibility. Volcker's rate hikes in 1979 to 1981 are a stage 4 act inside a stage 4 era. Painful, dramatic, precedent-setting, designed to force belief back into the currency. Same mechanism, promises outgrow the foundation, crisis arrives. Then a decisive act resets the game. Third proof, the Soviet Union's overextension and credibility cascade. Setup. After 1945, the USSR builds a security bloc in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact and Brezhnev Doctrine enforce Moscow's authority. The bargain is enforced stability. The center provides security and ideology. The periphery provides compliance, expansion. The Soviet system competes everywhere. Proxy wars, subsidies, arms, prestige. It builds a massive military-industrial machine. It tries to match the U.S. across domains, nuclear parity, global influence, space symbolism. On the surface, superpower balance. Underneath, an economy paying for credibility with resources it can't regenerate. Crisis. Afghanistan in 1979 becomes a long bleed. Oil revenue fluctuates. Technological gaps widen. Internal inefficiency becomes impossible to hide. In the periphery, people see the core truth. Moscow can project force, but it can't deliver prosperity. Outcome. Then the cascade. Once the system can't finance commitments and can't persuade its own bloc, it fractures. 1989 topples satellites. 1991 dissolves the Union. Again, not a surprise, but an end-stage outcome of expansion colliding with reality. 3 systems, same mechanism. Setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. Now we run it on today, coldly, line by line, because the sky over Tehran is not a mystery. It's a symptom. Stage 1, the setup, is a dual bargain. A security order and a financial order, both running on credibility. Security first. For decades, the region has lived inside an architecture shaped by you. Hess presence, intelligence networks, arms transfers, and sea lane protection. Israel's qualitative military edge didn't appear by magic. It sits inside that architecture as a pillar. Iran, facing conventional disadvantages and sanctions pressure, built a different kind of leverage. Asymmetry, missiles, drones, proxy networks, hardened infrastructure. The logic is simple. If you can't win in open battle, you make open battle too expensive. Overlay those 2 logics, and you do not get stability. You get a delayed detonation, stability that must be constantly maintained by credibility moves. Now the financial bargain. The world is not just armed, it's indebted. Debt is a promise about the future. And when the future feels less certain, the price of the promise rises. That's why $348 trillion of global debt is not a fun trivia fact. It's structural fragility. It means refinancing becomes a permanent stress test. It means energy shocks turn into inflation shocks faster. It means leaders have less room to absorb surprises. Setup established? Check. Stage 2, expansion, shows up in 3 places at once. Weapons, promises, and leverage. Weapons. Military spending is at record levels, so are capabilities. Drones don't just scout, they saturate defenses. Missiles don't just deter, they shape politics. Cyber doesn't just steal, it signals, promises. Red lines multiply. And here's the toxic secret of red lines. The more you draw, the more you must defend, because every unpunished violation rewrites your authority. Leverage. Debt rises. Bond issuance rises. States become refinancing machines. And leverage systems hate uncertainty, because uncertainty increases the cost of money, and the cost of money becomes the cost of politics. Expansion confirmed. Verified. Stage 3, crisis, is when the system starts losing fine control. In high-tech environments, crisis rarely arrives as a siren. It accumulates as almosts, almost intercepts, almost breaches, almost retaliations that don't stay limited. It looks manageable until it isn't. A drone hits what shouldn't be hittable. A missile penetrates a proven defense. A strike lands too close to a symbolic target. A proxy attack kills the wrong people. Suddenly, decision makers aren't choosing the best option. They're choosing the least catastrophic option from a shrinking list. And crisis is not only military, it's economic. Threaten shipping and you threaten energy. Threaten energy and you threaten inflation. Inflation pushes yields. Higher yields harden budgets. Hardened budgets intensify domestic anger. Domestic anger reduces tolerance for ambiguity. Reduced tolerance demands visible wins. Visible wins raise escalation. That is the feedback loop. Once it's running, calm becomes expensive. Crisis conditions present. Undeniable. Now stage 4, the outcome, the precedent act. This is where the reported F-35 engagement matters, even if the fog of war is thick and details evolve. Because an F-35 isn't just an aircraft. It's a message about a technological order. Stealth, sensor fusion, networked kill chains, first look, first shot. The promise is psychological as much as physical. You won't see it, you won't outthink it fast enough, and you won't set the tempo. So if Israel publicly claims an F-35I downed a crude Iranian aircraft over Tehran, that claim itself performs a function even before every detail is verified. It announces a new baseline. Direct air-to-air engagement over the opponent's capital is now on the table. And once a baseline moves, two things happen immediately. First, the challenged side must answer, because credibility is a currency that decays in public. Second, the system becomes more brittle because decision time compresses and control centralizes. Brittle systems don't bend, they snap. Outcome initiated. Check. Now, here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. If this is stage 4, what comes next? Because after the first precedent, the machine almost never cools down. It accelerates. Not because leaders are reckless, because late-stage orders can't tolerate ambiguity. Ambiguity becomes volatility. Volatility becomes higher funding costs. Higher funding costs become political instability. Political instability forces harder control. Harder control triggers more resistance. The side that was challenged seeks a response that demonstrates survivability and reach. If it can't win the air story, it wins the disruption story. Drones, missiles, proxies, cyber, maritime pressure, anything that forces the opponent's public to feel cost. Move 2 is coalition tightening. Allies demand reassurance. Neutral states demand guarantees. The dominant side expands coordination, surveillance, and strike options to prevent surprises. This is when a conflict becomes an architecture. Move 3 is economic weaponization. Insurance reprices risk. Shipping routes reroute. Sanctions widen. Energy and technology flows become bargaining chips. This is the moment the average person feels geopolitics in groceries, rent, and interest rates. Not because they joined a war, but because the system is repricing reality. If you can hold those 3 moves in your mind, you stop being shocked by the news. You start predicting the direction of the next headline. Now, I need to kill one comforting belief before it kills your judgment. Technology will prevent escalation. No. Technology makes escalation easier to justify. Precision reduces uncertainty in targeting. It does not reduce uncertainty in politics. In fact, precision often increases willingness to strike because it creates the illusion of control. It turns war into a management problem, dashboards, limited objectives, surgical actions. And management problems are what bureaucracies prefer, especially when they need visible wins fast. That's why "this time is different" is the most expensive sentence in history. They said it before 1914. Global trade was too interdependent. Then the corridor closed. They said it before 1971. The dollar-gold link was too foundational. Then the anchor broke. They said it before the Soviet collapse. A superpower couldn't dissolve. Then credibility cascaded. Every time the system proved the opposite, because the system doesn't care what you believe. It cares what it can sustain. So here is the warning, condensed into one hard truth. A world with $348 trillion of debt cannot afford prolonged ambiguity. A world spending $7 to $18 trillion on militaries does not keep those tools in storage forever. A world where red lines multiply is a world where the baseline will keep moving. The question is not whether the pattern continues. The question is whether you recognize the stage before the stage recognizes you. Now, What can you actually do with this practical, real, non-fantasy? First, stop consuming conflict headlines like random weather. Treat them like system indicators. When you see a precedent act, don't ask only what happened. Ask what rule just changed, because the rule change predicts the next move. Second, map your exposure to the loop: energy, shipping, currency, interest rates. If your income, savings, or business depends on stability in those 4 lanes, assume volatility is part of the era and build buffers accordingly. The macro system is leveraged enough. You don't need extra leverage in your own life. Third, build optionality. Optionality is survival capital. More than one income stream. Redundant suppliers. Skills that travel. Emergency reserves. Systems collapse as a collapse of options first, and only later a collapse of structures. And finally, watch for the tell that the machine is accelerating. When responses stop being proportional and start being symbolic. When leaders speak less about outcomes and more about credibility. When markets price risk not in basis points, but in panic. If that happens, you are not watching a single conflict. You are watching the system slide deeper into stage 4. So here's the direct call. If you want to understand how this machine was built, how debt, energy choke points, alliances, and technology fused into an engine that manufactures inevitable moments, subscribe. And watch the next video, because we're going one level deeper. Not just what happened over Tehran, but what happens after the first precedent becomes the new normal. And which signal will tell you the next stage has already started. Because what you're seeing is not the climax, it's the confirmation. And confirmations are how systems announce quietly and coldly that the next step is already in motion.